Welcome everyone. My name is Yi and I'm your host for Occupational Medicine Pearls podcast. Today I would like to review Respirable Crystalline Silica. What exactly is silica? Silica is silicon dioxide. It is a naturally occurring mineral that makes up a large proportion of the Earth's crust. It is one of the most abundant substances in rocks, soil, sand, and stone. From an occupational health perspective, not all silica behaves the same way. There are generally two broad forms of silica, non-crystalline and crystalline. Non-crystalline form is considered far less harmful to the lungs. The problem arises with crystalline silica, sometimes referred to as free silica. The key here is particle size. When silica-containing materials are cut, drilled, ground, or crushed, they can release dust particles small enough to reach the deepest part of the lungs, alveoli or terminal bronchioles. These particles are called respirable crystalline silica, and this is a form that causes lung injury and disease. If we are looking at as a revision here, Australia follows ISO 7708 classification of the particle sizes. We start with inhalable fraction, so they are particle up to 100 micrometer, and thoracic fraction is up to about 10. This can get to the terminal bronchioles. Anything below 10 micrometer is likely to reach to alveoli. So it starts about 2% certainty. The smaller it goes, the more rich chance of getting into the alveoli. Respiratory fraction is usually regarded around 4 micrometer and less. You might have heard of the term PM50 in the environmental health setting. PM10 relates to about 10 micrometer, and PM2.5 overlap with the respirable fraction here, but they are used in different contexts. Where do we find silica? The most common form of crystalline silica is in quartz. Quartz is found in varying amount across everyday construction materials. Granite typically contain about 25 to 40% quartz, and shales average around 22%. And sandstone can contain 2/3 quartz or more. In fact, quartz is a primary component of sand found in riverbeds, beaches, and deserts. There are also less common crystalline form of silica, including cristobalite and tridymite. So I haven't touched base on anything about engineering stone at all. Why? Well, engineering stone is more of a man-made problem. It is one of the most important developments in recent years that we introduce in the workplace. So composite stone products, commonly used for bench tops or countertops, they can contain up to 97% crystalline silica, and when these materials are cut or polished, especially using dry methods, they can generate extremely high concentrations of respirable silica dust, let alone other sizes of dust that we could be inhaling. This has led to a marked increase in cases of accelerated silicosis and progressive massive fibrosis, which often affect relatively young workers only with a few years of exposure. If we have to summarize here, naturally occurring stones and silica has relatively low content of silica, but if we are using the engineered stone, it can contain high amount of silica. And if we are using through dry cutting techniques, that will expose the workers to very high amount of silica that goes into the respiratory tract. Let's look over which occupations are still at high risk. Under work health and safety legislation, crystalline silica is classified as a restricted hazardous chemical. One important regulatory example is abrasive blasting. So if materials containing more than 1% crystalline silica must not be used without specific authorization, and also maybe health surveillance as well. From a clinical perspective, it is essential to recognize the type of works mostly likely to generate hazardous exposure. That include, now the list is quite long, fabrication, installation, and removal of composite stone countertops. If we are drilling, excavating, or moving earth to the ground with the high silica content, clay and stone processing, paving, surfacing and road construction, tunneling, mining, quarrying and mineral processing, construction laboring and demolition work, brick, concrete and stone cutting, particularly one done dry, which I don't believe is allowed these days, abrasive blasting, foundry casting, angle grinding, hydraulic fracturing in oil and gas operations, pottery and ceramic manufacturing. That one is one of the key work sites for the A-Form trainees. Crushing, loading, hauling, and dumping of rock and spoil, and even cleanup activities such as dry sweeping or blowing dust with the compressed air pump. Cleaning up tasks are often overlooked and can generate some of the highest short-term exposure, especially in the stone cutting industry. Another important thing to remember is that job title alone may be insufficient to know, and we need to get a detailed task-based exposure history to understand the duration and the type of exposure and what type of materials are being handled there. There are also non-occupational exposure for many workers. Silica is ubiquitous in our environment, and non-occupational exposure can occur in communities near industrial operations such as quartz crushing, ceramics manufacturing, sandstone milling, or silica flour protection. Natural sources such as desert dust storm or windblown sand can also contribute to background exposure. So the key takeaway here is straightforward. Silica is everywhere, but the disease is driven by form, particle size, and how the material is handled. After the occupations, we will cover the occupational hygiene aspect. The permissible exposure limit for respirable crystalline silica is extremely low. In Australia, the current workplace exposure standard is 0.05 milligram per cubic meter, and the AIOH support this value for the practicalities of measurement. However, their stance is stated as exposure should be kept as low as reasonably practicable, and there has been debate about lowering the limit to 0.025 milligram per cubic meter or even 0.02 milligram per cubic meter. And they highlighted a practical barrier is measurement uncertainty. I believe this is in response to the upcoming changes to the exposure standard. So when we are not sure whether we are achieving a target, what's the point of measuring? That's how I see that. But we will get to handle that when we get there. I will reconfirm the current workplace exposure standard for respirable crystalline silica is 0.05 milligram per cubic meter. How do we monitor respiratory silica in the air? AIOH recommend that the workplaces perform near full shift sampling, and the labs has to be NATA accredited labs. And standard analysis methods such as XRD or FTII can be used, and avoid triggering levels below 0.05 milligram per cubic meter because of measurement uncertainty below that. And that level is protective if enforced, and most workplaces can control RCS using conventional methods, such as wet cutting, local exhaust ventilation, positive pressure cabins, and segregations. The biggest failure has been systemic issues such as poor control, poor enforcement, and poor monitoring. For non-engineering stone products, the idea that there is no safe limit is incorrect. Evidence supports the threshold and it is shown to be protective. However, the exposure should still be kept as low as practically possible. So if I have to summarize that bit, for non-engineering stone products, the exposure level of 0.05 milligram per cubic meter is protective, and for engineering stone products, it is a different issue. Nonetheless, we need to keep the exposure level as low as practically possible. After occupational hygiene monitoring, we will move to pre-employment or health surveillance medical assessments. It will include baseline and periodic symptom questionnaires, physical examination, doing spirometry, and chest imaging using standardized systems. During history taking, personal history such as smoking should be documented, and if there is any history of immune-related condition, rheumatological condition should be documented as well. Any previous history of tuberculosis or any respiratory condition be documented. The key here to discuss is about chest imaging. Chest x-rays should always be performed as a baseline before or at the start of work involving respirable crystalline silica, and the baseline is useful for follow-up. Without it, detecting meaningful change over time becomes far more difficult. Now, the frequency of follow-up chest x-ray is not fixed. It should be determined by the level and intensity of exposure, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. For workers in lower-risk occupations or industries, the recommended approach is chest X-ray every 5 years for the first 20 years of exposure. However, that interval should be shortened if certain red flags, such as abnormal image finding or exposure above the workplace exposure standard or a long cumulative exposure history beyond 20 years. In these circumstances, 3-yearly imaging may be more appropriate. In any case, that has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. In the case of very heavy exposure, annual imaging may even be warranted. Another critical point that we need to consider is that where and how these X-rays are performed. Generally speaking, the chest X-ray are performed and read by radiologists with the AIOH Stage B reader qualification, and the quality of interpretation is important to meet the standards as well. Other than chest X-ray, what can we do? We have better options available, but they may not be practicable and available to everyone in the industries. High-resolution computer tomography or HRCT should be considered in the high-risk occupations in the place of normal chest X-rays. Compared to that, they are certainly more sensitive and can detect early or accelerated silicosis better than, and they can also identify subtle parenchymal changes long before they become visible on plain AIOH chest X-rays. The difficulty that we may encounter is that many silica-exposed workers move between employers, particularly in the construction and mining, so we need to be careful about unnecessary repeated imaging and cumulative radiation exposure. The scans may not replace a good occupational history, provided that the worker is telling you everything that is a true basis. Beyond imaging, we have other more advanced tests to assist with rapidly progressive or advanced silicosis. In these cases, or in these workers with these conditions, tests such as diffusing capacity for carbon monoxide, DLCO for short, can provide valuable insights into gas exchange impairment. This testing is typically available only through specialist respiratory labs and could certainly be limited in rural or regional settings. So the key takeaway message is that imaging and monitoring should be proportionate to the risk, guided by the exposure intensity, and need to be used thoughtfully. The next area that we cover, similar to other episodes, is about the health effects. Silicosis is not just a respiratory condition. It is different to asbestos for sure. And one thing we need to look at it is silica, by entering through the small alveoli, can activate our immune system. When respirable silica reach the alveoli, the macrophages attempt to phagocytose the particles. However, silica is cytotoxic to these cells. The macrophages rupture, releasing inflammatory mediators and fibrogenic cytokines, which then recruit additional immune cells. This creates a self-perpetuating inflammatory cycle. Over the time, this leads to the local nodular pulmonary fibrosis and then progressive massive fibrosis. Such kind of situation increase susceptibility to tuberculosis and, unfortunately, also increased risk of lung cancer. One important point here is that silicosis can progress even after exposure had ceased. The lung tissues are not the only target organ. It can also affect our kidney and joints, causing conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis and systemic sclerosis. We'll cover that in detail in the following session. Now we can dive into more details about the silicosis. So silicosis is not a single disease entity. It exists on the spectrum with 4 recognized clinical patterns as mentioned below. The most common is a simple nodular silicosis, characterized by radiologically with small rounded opacities, usually less than 1 centimeter, predominantly in the upper lung zone. Hilar lymphadenopathy may be present, sometimes with characteristic calcification. Lung function at this stage should be normal and preserved. As the disease progresses, nodules may enlarge and coalesce, transitioning into progressive massive fibrosis. At this stage, fibrotic masses exceed 1 centimeter, surrounding the lung tissue became emphysematous, and pulmonary function deteriorates substantially. Accelerated silicosis develop over a much shorter time frame, often within 2 to 5 years, following intense exposure. This pattern is increasingly recognized in a modern high silica industry and carry a far more aggressive course. At the extreme end is acute silicosis, also known as silicoproteinosis. So what is acute silicosis? Acute silicosis occurs after a very high exposure over a short period of time. Instead of fibrotic nodules, there was not enough time to cause fibers anymore. The alveoli fill with lipid and protein-rich material, severely impairing oxygen exchange. This form of disease has been documented in underground or enclosed work settings where respiratory protection is absent, notably among workers cutting or polishing composite stones with extremely high silica content. Clinically, acute silicosis presents with rapidly progressive dyspnea, hypoxia, and respiratory failure. Death often occurs within months of symptom onset, unfortunately. Pulmonary function tests typically show a restricted pattern with marked gas exchange abnormalities. After that, we look at chronic. Even in the absence of overt silicosis, chronic silica exposure can cause chronic bronchitis and COPD. After all, they are dust, and we are not supposed to inhale anything other than air. Importantly, this could occur independently of smoking, although smoking magnifies the effects, which is not very surprising. Workers with established silicosis have a well-documented increased susceptibility to tuberculosis, a risk that persists long after exposure ends. Beyond the lung tissue, epidemiological studies show higher rate of autoimmune diseases, including scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis, and systemic lupus erythematosus. Over the past decade, growing evidence also linked crystalline silica exposure to chronic kidney disease, particularly glomerulonephritis. If I have to summarize, silica exposure is a systemic inflammatory hazard, not just a lung-isolated issue. Lung just happen to be the exposure pathway into our body. If we look at the renal disease, what is the actual problem here? There were several epidemiology studies done where the occupational exposure to respiratory silica exists, and they show that increased risk of kidney disease. And the studies were mostly with sand and gravel worker, and they have roughly doubled the risk for non-malignant renal disease, although no increase in kidney cancer was observed in that group. Other studies, such as those involving granite workers, had found an increased risk of kidney cancer. So there is a bit of a mixed picture here. Nonetheless, the many silica-exposed cohorts show that elevated mortality ratios with the renal disease, but they could not prove a consistent dose-response relationship. Perhaps there are limitations by the methodology of the research and diagnostic limitations, rather than a direct causal relationship. So what we know so far is there is very likely association between silica exposure and renal disease, but we don't know a direct causal link, particularly for the kidney cancers. And then we will move to autoimmune disease, which the evidence is more compelling. And there is a substantial body of epidemiological research has shown there is a strong association between respirable crystalline silica exposure with severe autoimmune conditions as mentioned above. The association appeared to be strongest in the mining and high dust industry. The Australian data and other countries have shown that 2 to 4-fold increase in risk of systemic sclerosis in silica-exposed men. Importantly, the latency period can be long, often 2 to 3 decades, meaning the disease may present many years after exposure began or left the work. The last condition we need to know is silica and lung cancer. Respirable fraction of crystalline silica, that's very important detail. Particularly quartz is classified as category 1A, and there are multiple occupational studies across industry and countries has already demonstrated that there is increased risk of lung cancer among silica-exposed workers. And the risk is particularly elevated in those with underlying pulmonary fibrosis, including silicosis. If I have to summarize the clinical effects, silica can cause acute silicosis, or in terms of chronic, it can be pulmonary fibrosis, chronic bronchitis, or COPD. It can also affect the chronic kidney disease, and autoimmune conditions such as scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis, and systemic sclerosis. So I would like to close the episode now, and the central message of this episode is that crystalline silica causes progressive multi-system disease, often silently at first, and with no safe exposure threshold for workers with engineering stone in particular. And Australia had banned engineering stone, which is good, but there are also many occupations with still had exposure to silica. And the uncertainty is about setting the right exposure limit and the ongoing need for health surveillance and monitoring. And the most important of all is workplace control. Thank you for listening to the Occupational Medicine Pearls podcast. If you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with your colleagues involved in the work health and safety, and I wish you well. See you next time.